Okay, today I'm going to show you how to create a snowflake using Illustrator and using all the transform tools in here. So I'm going to go pretty quick. Don't forget you can pause and rewind if you miss anything, and I hope you enjoy it. So first thing we're going to do is create a new document. I'm going to make it a squared shaped artboard. Mine will be 12 by 12 inches, but yours can be any size you want. And the first thing we're going to need to do is draw a vertical line and a horizontal line right in the center of our canvas. So behind the rectangle tool, if you click and hold, you'll find the line segment tool. I'm going to drag from the top of the page, holding shift down past the bottom of the page. And I'll do the same thing horizontally, past the left side, holding shift past the right side. Now I know by holding shift, those are perfectly straight up and down and sideways. And if I select both of them by dragging a box and using the selection tool up here, this black arrow, I can then go to my properties pane and align them horizontally with the align and vertically. And if after clicking both those buttons, I know that this is crossing dead center of my artboard. That's going to be important in a second. I'll explain why. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to draw a little bit of our snowflake. So I'm going to take the paintbrush tool to draw that. I'm going to select a different color. Let's pick a nice light blue color, maybe a bluish gray. There we go. I'm going to give this a little bit heavier of a stroke, maybe a stroke 6. And I'm going to draw just to the right side of this vertical line, and you'll see why in a moment. So maybe I'll just draw a triangle here. Now, that's going to be part of the point of one of my points of my snowflake. But we want this to first reflect horizontally, okay? And then we're going to rotate that complete triangle, because it'll be reflected, around this to create all the other 5 points of our snowflake. So first thing we're going to do is select everything on here. And we're actually going to go to the layers tool. And if you notice, everything is selected, but the layer is not selected. And I'm going to show you what happens if we don't select the layer. Okay, so each individual object, we have 3 objects right now, our 2 lines and our little triangle. And if I go to Effect, Distort and Transform, and say Transform, if I reflect this, notice this triangle that I was reflecting didn't reflect across the halfway line of the canvas. It just reflected about its own center. Okay, and what you can't tell is this vertical line reflected and the horizontal line reflected, but after they reflect, they still look the same. It might make sense if we don't do a reflection, if we do our second operation, which is a transformation, a rotation of 60 degrees. Let me click preview here. Here you can see, well, the line rotated around that center point where we wanted to, but this little triangle, instead of rotating around that center point, it just rotated around its own center in place. So let's cancel that. We don't want them to rotate around each individual part center. We want them to rotate around the center of the whole thing, and that's why we have to select the layer, this blue dot on the layers pane. And now if we do that transformation, it's acting on the entire layer together. And all objects, instead of being rotated and reflected about their own center, they'll be reflected and rotated around the center of that layer. And the center of that layer is the dead center of our canvas. So we're going to go to Effect, Distort and Transform, and Transform. And now when we reflect about the X, notice that has reflected directly across that center line. And we don't want it to just reflect, we want to make a copy when it reflects over there. So I'm going to add 1 copy and check this preview box, and we can see now we've created that complete triangle. And we'll say OK. And now we want a second transformation. And I can go to Effect, same thing, Distort and Transform, or the Effect menu gives you your most recent tool that you've used right at the top. So I'm going to go to Effect Transform as a little shortcut. We're going to do a second effect. We don't want to change that first effect we did. We're applying a new effect. And instead of reflecting, we are now doing our rotation. We're going to do a 60-degree rotation. And we're going to not just do it once, there's a second point, but we're going to do it 5 times. And if we click that preview box, now we can see we're starting to get our snowflake appearance. Okay? And so we can say OK. And now the last thing we're going to do is, if you notice, when I drew this blue line, when I crossed the center line, the part where I crossed, that was also reflected. But we're actually going to create what's called a clipping mask. That basically allows me to draw anything I want, but only within a certain region of our canvas. And we want it to be this triangle here to the right of that vertical line in the top quadrant. So I'll show you another line here, what I mean by that. So let's draw, I'm going to draw a, and if you see again here, we have that crossover where I went outside that triangle, and it looks a little sloppy. It's okay, this would be fine, we could keep working with this, but I'm actually going to remove that. So we're going to use a shape, a rectangle tool, and we're going to create a rectangle and then turn it into a triangle that will create a clipping mask for this triangular area. So anything outside of that won't appear. So we're still in layer 1. We're going to draw and make sure it says intersect, because this box is going to start right at the center of our canvas. And if you have smart grids on, so snap to point, that will make sure that things align with other objects on the page. And I'm actually, before I do anything, make sure nothing is selected, I'm going to change this so that I have a black outline. I don't want this box to have a blue outline. Actually, it's going to have no outline in a little bit and no fill. Okay, you could have left it with a blue outline, but all my guides are going to have black outlines, or black strokes, we call them. Now it says intersect. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag and I'm going to move up and to the right. I just don't want to go past the top of that vertical line. So anywhere up here and to the right, as long as it's not past the highest point of that vertical line. And I'm going to leave the top corner of that rectangle near the end of this diagonal line. Okay, and you can see that also reflected and rotated just like everything else that's drawn on the page. Now it gets a little confusing because there's lots of lines here, but the only lines that are really there is that one box that I drew. It's still highlighted blue. And again, we wanted this to be a triangular clipping mask, not a rectangle. So a rectangle minus this bottom corner will turn into a triangle. So if we go to the pen tool, when we go over anchor points, there's 4 anchor points in a rectangle. If we go over one of them, you'll see a little minus sign there. If I click that, it will remove that corner, and now we can see this blue triangle. So we're getting really close to creating a shape that takes up just that one triangle that we want to highlight and only allow marks in there. And then all we have to do now is just move this corner of our triangle to this line. And again, since snap to point is on, as long as I go to, notice there's 2 types of selection tool. We can go to the direct select tool, that's the white arrow, and that allows us to move individual points or individual anchor points. So I'm going to click it before I start clicking and dragging. Now that's highlighted. If I look at any of the other points on that triangle, they're white. But the one I just clicked is blue. That means it's selected, and I'm going to only be moving that point. So I'm going to move it just to show you, and I move that point. And now if I zoom in a little bit, I'm going to drag that point to the corner, and it snaps into place on that guide that we had before. And we have a triangle just in that top right portion of our snowflake. And as long as that triangle is the top layer of this layer 1, so there it is. You can kind of see it, it's very faint, but if I click and unclick view, you can see it, that triangle appears and disappears. So a clipping mask will be whatever the top layer is, whatever that shape is, only allow shapes below it to show when they're inside that shape. And I'll show you what I mean. So we're going to click on a top level click that blue dot on layer 1, and we're going to say at the bottom of the layers menu, make/release clipping mask. And when I click that, notice what happens to these lines that extend outside of that triangle. So let's click it. Those lines disappear. So you can still see that path. And this path over here, you can still see it if I zoom in on them. But there's no color over here when that extended past my clipping mask triangle. And the other thing you can notice is once that becomes a clipping mask, it has no stroke anymore. Okay, so it makes it invisible because we usually don't want to see the edges of our clipping masks. Now, one of the last things we're going to do is get rid of these vertical and horizontal guidelines. Not get rid of them, we still want them to be there, but we just don't want to see them. So when I click on that line, that vertical line, you can see that it's telling me that it has a stroke. I'm just going to make that stroke none. And that just disappeared. There we are. And so all those lines are still there, but they're hidden. They can't be seen. And inside this triangle is the only place we'll be able to draw our snowflake. So I'm going to go to the paintbrush tool again. I need to make sure I'm using some color right now because I don't have a color. Let's try and pick a nice snow blue. Okay. And now as I draw inside this area, we get all that repetitive snowflake beauty. And you can get as creative as you want to. And there we have a snowflake. Now, remember, we're going to be using this design on a laser cutter. So what our finished piece is going to be is a cutout of everything that's blue. So first of all, what I notice in this design is that there's lots and lots of detail, and all these lines are pretty thin. And it's going to be hard for the laser to cut these teeny tiny skinny parts, depending on what material we're cutting them out of. So we're going to make this a little bit simpler, and we're also going to make our lines a little bit bolder. And then we're going to have to process them. So the nice thing about this is if we take the selection tool and we drag it around that top triangle area, and I'm going to hold shift. I've selected lots of stuff. Actually, I think I've selected basically everything in my whole file. I'm going to just hold shift to remove some of them. I want to keep my guides and I want to keep my clipping mask, but I'm going to get rid of all the other shapes that make up my snowflake, and I'm going to just click delete. And so the triangle clipping mask and the two guidelines are still there, but nothing else. And I'm going to click that paint tool. I'm going to go to properties. I'm going to increase this stroke. Let's I don't know, stroke 8 sounds okay. And now I'm going to try and draw some points. Here we go. And I actually think this is starting to look pretty nice. I like the, hexagonal shape that we're starting to see. But I actually think that this stuff still could be a little bit bolder. Our stroke didn't stay stroke 6. So here we go. These are getting thicker. This is going to be something that will be no problem for our, and we can see now we have a paintbrush that's much wider than it was originally. All right, and maybe, okay. That's looking pretty. And maybe we'll add a different 0.5, and maybe we'll add a little bit of detail, not too much, but a little bit thinner. So I think this is looking pretty good. You could spend all day kind of refining this. I'm going to get these inner ones, maybe I'll make these a little thinner. I like that. I'm gonna be sticking with that. I think that's a nice snowflake. I said I'd leave it, but I'm gonna change it a tiny bit. I'm gonna increase these. Like I said, you can keep going with this all day long. Now, I kind of like the way this looks, but I'm going to point out something. If every shape is cut out from the laser, notice what's going to happen here. Only these lines on the outside are touching, and this inner, I guess I'm going to call it a star, isn't attached. There's white space between it and the outer piece. So if I cut all this blue stuff out, this inner star is going to fall out of my shape. So I still need to increase these a little bit more, or maybe I'm going to add a little connection here. Now, I said we were going to simplify things, but I'm making them a little more complicated. What do we think? I think it's pretty good. I said I'd stop. Now you're just watching me play and add detail. You can spend hours doing this, but let's say that's good enough. All right. Now remember, our laser cutter just follows our instructions. So for now, if I highlight this, every blue line that's part of this drawing is going to be cut by the laser. Now, when I say blue line, I'm talking about these thin blue lines. Those are the instructions that we'd be giving to the laser. So all it would do is cut one line, and then one vertical line, and then this little skinny line. What we really want is it to cut on each side of this snow blue line. We want to cut around it and on the inside of that line. Okay? And also, all this other stuff that has no dark blue lines, it doesn't even know about that. It only knows about the things that I actually drew in this top right area under the clipping mask. So we need to get these blue lines everywhere in our snowflake. And then we have to get the blue lines to be on the inside and outside of every one of these strokes. So I'll show you how to do that. Once we select our whole layer, everything here, we're going to go to Object, Expand Appearance. And now notice what that does. Every one of these, all of a sudden, became its own shape. And it's not just the ones in the top area, it's all of them together. And they have a outline around them. It's not just the center line where I drew the stripe, but it's a full shape all the way around. But it's even some of the stuff I can see outside of my clipping mask as well. So I don't want it to cut all the way around this blue line. I only want it to cut around the light blue part. So we need to do one more final step. Again, actually, I don't have to drag a box. I can go up to here and select that blue dot so that I've selected everything inside of my layer one, the top layer one. There's a few of them there. And I'm going to go to Properties, and in the Properties pane, you'll see this Pathfinder tool. There's 4 options here, but we want to go to a different option that's called Merge. Okay, so here it is. If you highlight over it, it'll kind of appear. And when I click Merge, it just merged everything that's in that layer. And that's it. We have our snowflake. This is ready to go. And this blue shape that I'm dragging around the page, that's what's going to be cut out of your material that you put into your laser cutter. Okay, so the final step of this will be to save this as an SVG file. So I'm actually going to first, for my own personal use, save this as, I'm going to save it to my computer, and I'm going to call this Snowflake. default snowflake. Let's call it 3 because I think I've been doing a few of these, and I'm going to hit save. And then that's fine. Use all the defaults. And now I'm going to save this as an SVG. Save as. Instead of an Adobe Illustrator file, I'm just going to go to Format and go to SVG. And it just changes the suffix up here, and when this drop down is SVG, as soon as I click Save here, it already keeps the same name. Now this is saving, all these defaults look fine, to my computer, an SVG file that we'll be able to upload to our laser cutter, and it will follow all those instructions to cut the outside line of this. Some machines may I forgot one important step. We're going to want to change our fill and our stroke. So right now, we see this. It has a fill and it has no stroke. We're going to change this so it has a black outline and no fill. Okay? Because the laser cutter will cut out every outline that's there. And the fill, which is what I forgot before, the fill itself is going to be, if there's a color inside the fill, it's going to burn the material, what we call engrave. The laser cutter's on, but it's just less power, and it'll just burn a small layer of your material away. And we don't want to burn everything. We just want to cut out each one of these lines. So don't forget that last step, making sure there's a stroke and no fill. And now we're good to go. Let's resave that file. Save as. Okay, same name. We'll just save over it. Save, replace. And now we're good to go. We'll be able to upload this, and I'll show that in another video. So I hope that helped. Enjoy.